The thread of my usefulness, thin and fraying, finally snapped when I realized the only sound my family truly appreciated was the quiet, predictable clatter of my own martyrdom. I am Elena, 67, and for decades, my life has been an exercise in relentless, unpaid service. My existence was defined by the precise timing of dinner, the immaculate cleanliness of the baseboards, and the immediate silent availability of my emotional and physical labor. I was the reliable engine of our family's comfort, but engines are not seen. They are merely expected to run. The humiliation I swallowed was a slow, cumulative poison, administered in small, daily doses of casual contempt. My daughter, Clara, a woman whose aesthetic standards were as ruthless as her ambition, often launched the first assault, usually over the phone while I was folding laundry she had neglected. "Mom," she'd sigh, the word laden with world-weary judgment. "You dress like the clearance section of a forgotten thrift store. Can't you just wear something flattering? You make me look bad when we go out." It wasn't about the clothes. It was about the disappointment I represented, the failure to evolve into the sleek, modern mother she felt entitled to claim. My son, Mark, the brilliant academic, employed a quieter, more surgical form of cruelty. Every opinion I ventured, on politics, on literature, even on the recipe for the holiday roast, was met with the same dismissive, heavy sigh and the inevitable, crushing sentence. "Mom, you just don't understand anything anymore. The world has moved on." His pity was worse than Clara's criticism. It wasn't just a critique of my intellect. It was a scheduled retirement of my entire relevance. And then there was Edward, my ex-husband, who had left 20 years ago for a younger, brighter model, but who still felt entitled to drop by occasionally, usually to pick up his dry cleaning or drop off tax documents, just to deliver one final wounding observation. "Elena," he'd comment, running a critical eye over my tired face, "you've aged badly. You really should take better care of yourself. But then again, you never were very good at effort, were you?" The sheer audacity of his continued entitlement, his casual, lingering cruelty, felt like a structural flaw in the universe. I had spent 50 years trying to prove my worth to a circle of people who seemed happier when I was miserable, when my unhappiness confirmed their superiority. Why do we keep showing up for people who only acknowledge our presence when we perform the role of the predictable martyr? Every small flicker of desire I showed for a self outside the confines of the kitchen was immediately extinguished by a wave of crushing sarcasm. I bought a yoga mat. Clara snorted. "Yoga? At your age? You'll break a hip trying to be spiritual." I signed up for a beginner's watercolor class. Mark rolled his eyes. "Painting? What for, Mom? Nobody will hang your scribbles. Stick to the garden. At least that's productive." I dared to buy a new, slightly expensive pair of walking shoes. Edward's comment, delivered over the phone. "Why do you need new shoes, Elena? You stay home all day. You'll just scuff them." They called me useless. They treated me like a convenience. And the terrifying part was that after decades of this subtle, systemic erasure, I had begun to believe them. My self-worth had been systematically outsourced to their fleeting, conditional approval. The thread snapped not under the heavy hand of an adult's cruelty, but under the terrifying clarity of a child's innocent observation. My grandson, 8-year-old Leo, a wonderfully perceptive boy, was watching me clean up the aftermath of a chaotic Sunday dinner, during which Mark had meticulously dissected my political views and Edward had casually insulted my cooking. The room was empty now, save for the lingering scent of judgment and lukewarm coffee. Leo stood in the doorway, clutching a battered dinosaur toy, his brow furrowed with the seriousness only a child can muster. "Grandma?" he asked, his voice low and troubled. "Why do they talk to you like you're not a real person?" The question was not a challenge. It was a profound, agonizing thrust of truth. It shattered the comfortable, self-pitying narrative I had built around my victimhood. It wasn't just me who felt invisible. It was visible to a child. The subtle abuse had become loud, obvious, and was now being taught as a generational pattern. I knelt down, meeting his earnest, worried eyes. The truth of his question hit me with the force of a physical blow. They didn't talk to me like I wasn't a real person because I had stopped behaving like one. I hugged him tightly, a sudden, fierce rush of resolve hardening the soft, compliant center of my chest. "They won't, darling. Not anymore." That night, after the last dirty dish was stacked, the lights were turned off, and the silent house settled into its familiar pattern of neglect, I went to my bedroom. I didn't storm out. I didn't announce my intentions. I acted with the quiet, surgical precision of someone executing a long-delayed financial audit. I packed a single, functional gray canvas suitcase, not for a grand tour, but for an escape. I packed only what I needed for 7 days. 3 simple outfits, my best walking shoes, the ones Edward had mocked, my journal, and a brand new copy of Walden. I sat down at the kitchen table, the epicenter of my servitude, and wrote a note on a plain white index card. It was concise, unarguable, and entirely factual. The note simply read, "I am gone for 1 week. Do not call unless someone is actively dying. Do not enter my house." I placed the note under the coffee canister, the last item they would reach for in the morning. At 4 a.m., before the first hint of false dawn could touch the windows, I walked out of the house. I drove my old sedan toward the coast, a 3-hour journey I had often dreamed of, but never permitted myself to take. I had booked myself into a small, anonymous cottage facing the Atlantic. It was a place dedicated to silent meditation and self-reflection, a retreat that promised no judgment, no expectations, and no demands. As I checked in, the woman at the desk handed me a small basket. "There is a strict rule here, dear," she said gently. "All devices must be turned off and placed in the basket until your departure." I walked into my small, Spartan room, a single bed, a wooden desk, and a window overlooking the vast, gray, indifferent ocean. I sat on the edge of the bed, took out my phone, and with a slow, deliberate movement, pressed the power button. As the small screen went dark, a profound, aching realization washed over me. The sudden, absolute cessation of all possible communication, the silence that guaranteed they could not reach me, criticize me, or demand anything of me, was not terrifying. It was the most intensely liberating moment of my adult life. I felt, physically, the sudden, shocking absence of a massive weight I had been carrying for decades. The weight of their expectations, the weight of their sneering judgments, the weight of my own desperate need for their fleeting, poisonous approval. My life had been so heavy. Now, without them, I felt light. Absolutely, irrevocably light. The 7 days were a blur of cold ocean air, endless, rhythmic meditation, and the slow, agonizing process of listening to my own, unedited voice. I walked the deserted, windswept beaches for hours. I wrote pages in my journal, filling the pages not with the concerns of my children, but with the raw, neglected desires of my 67 years. Did I ever truly want to be a housewife? Or was it the role that offered the least resistance to Edward's towering ego? Is it possible to rebuild a future with dignity when all the blueprints of your past were drawn by other people's needs? I spent one afternoon watching the waves relentlessly crash against the immovable granite seawall. The ocean didn't care about the wall, or the resistance, or the force required. It simply flowed. It simply existed. I realized my life had been spent trying to be a permeable membrane, absorbing all their negative energy. Now I wanted to be the granite, solid, unmoved, and utterly indifferent to the incoming tide of their disappointment. The food was simple, the schedule monastic. The only sounds were the wind and the surf. I didn't miss them. I missed me, the vibrant, intellectual, deeply curious young woman whose voice had been extinguished by a lifetime of domestic administration. On the 6th day, I packed my bag. I was no longer the Elena who left. I was something harder, quieter, and entirely self-possessed. I had performed a massive, necessary excavation of my soul, and I returned not with a list of grievances, but with a strategic plan. I drove back early on the 7th morning, arriving before dawn. The house looked exactly as I had left it, immaculate, silent, and entirely reflective of my past servitude. I walked in, the key turning smoothly in the lock. The note, the single index card, was still under the coffee canister. They had obeyed the one instruction I had given them. They had been paralyzed by the sheer, uncharacteristic finality of my absence. The immediate reaction, once they realized I was home, was chaotic, predictable fury. Clara rushed over first, her face a mask of frantic, self-centered worry. "Mom, where were you? We were worried sick. Do you know how irresponsible that was? Mark had to come over to find his clean shirts. We thought something terrible had happened." "Something terrible did happen, Clara," I replied, meeting her gaze, my voice level and quiet. "It happened every day I was here." Mark followed, his face tight with intellectual offense. "Mom, you can't just leave without warning. That's emotionally manipulative. You destabilized everything. We couldn't even get Edward to fix the leaky faucet." "You're right, Mark," I conceded, walking past them both toward the front door, pulling a small, labeled package from my coat pocket. "I did destabilize your convenience. That was the point." I reached into the package and pulled out a small steel tool. I looked at the old, familiar lock, the lock that symbolized my constant accessibility. Without a word, without explanation, I began to change the locks. The sound of the drill, the scrape of metal against metal, was loud, mechanical, and irreversible. It was the sound of a boundary being established. Clara gasped. Mark looked genuinely bewildered. "Mom, what are you doing?" Clara cried, aghast at the sudden absolute rejection of their access. I finished the job, testing the new key in the cylinder. I turned around, facing them both, my brilliant, demanding children, and felt nothing but the calm, immutable strength of the ocean I had stared at for 7 days. When they asked, with genuine, confused outrage, what had happened, why I had done this, and where I had been, I finally gave them the answer I had composed on the cold, beautiful beach, the single, final, devastating sentence of my liberation. I stopped living for people who are happier when I'm miserable. The shock rendered them speechless. It was the first time in their lives I had refused to provide an emotional explanation or a soothing apology. My new life began that minute. I locked the door behind them as they stumbled out, confused and defeated, into the cold, familiar afternoon. The lock clicked shut with a sharp, beautiful finality. I walked into my quiet kitchen and, for the first time in 20 years, I put on the kettle just for me. The silence was glorious, and it was entirely, fiercely mine. The morning after I changed the locks and delivered my final, unarguable sentence, the siege began. It was not a violent assault, but a persistent, whiny demand for the reinstatement of their convenience. The doorbell rang precisely at 8:05 a.m., the time Mark usually dropped off his laundry bag. I ignored it. The ringing continued, a frantic, irritated staccato sound, until Mark realized I wouldn't answer, and I heard the frustrated roar of his engine pulling away. Then came the texts, a torrent of digital aggression designed to weaponize my guilt. Clara, Mom, this is ridiculous. I need my good dress for the gallery event tonight. Let me in now. What kind of mother does this? Mark, I am officially late for my lecture because I don't have my notes, which you organized for me. Your passive aggression is deeply toxic, Elena. I need the new code. Edward, the most venomous. I need the keys to the safe deposit box. You are disrupting my financial life. You need to stop this childish tantrum and behave like an adult. I read every single message, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of freshly brewed tea. The new silence of the house a palpable, comforting presence. I felt the familiar, reflexive clench in my stomach, the conditioned response to their demands. But this time, the feeling passed quickly. The guilt was a phantom limb. The nerve endings were cut. I replied only once to the group chat, a brief, impersonal directive. I am restructuring my life. All services are suspended indefinitely. I will contact you when I am ready to schedule supervised access to your belongings. No emotion, no explanation, no apology. The lack of vulnerability was my new armor. How many years does it take to unlearn the primal female instinct that demands you prioritize the immediate comfort of others over your own desperate necessity? The psychological adjustment was the hardest part. The house, once my sanctuary of service, now felt like a vast, empty expanse demanding a new purpose. The sheer freedom was terrifying. I found myself walking into the kitchen at the precise moment I used to start Edward's breakfast, my hands twitching, anticipating the task. When I realized there was no task, only silence, a profound sense of despair would momentarily surface. I had been defined by my utility. Now, I was defined only by my existence. I took the first tentative steps toward reclaiming the self they had ridiculed. I unpacked the yoga mat. I laid it down in the living room near the large bay window. I turned on a quiet, instrumental piece of music. Not the loud, demanding music Mark preferred, but something gentle, fluid, and entirely for me. The first attempts at the poses were clumsy, painful, and deeply humbling. My body was stiff, betraying years of emotional compression and physical servitude. As I tried to hold a simple warrior pose, my arms shook, and the bitterness flared. Bitterness that I had ceded my physical vitality to people who scorned it. But I persisted. The effort was not about fitness. It was about occupying my own body. It was about telling myself, through strained muscle and deep, controlled breath, that I was still capable of generating strength from within. The next day, I retrieved the watercolor set they had mocked. I set up a small easel by the window, ignoring the dust of years. My hands, practiced in the meticulous detail of dusting and folding, felt awkward and uncertain holding the brush. The first painting was a childish, chaotic mess, a blur of color with no form. I looked at it, and instead of the self-deprecating shame that Mark's voice would have triggered, I felt a surge of quiet hope. It was bad, but it was mine. It was a scribble of my own desire, a messy, personal expression that required no external validation. As I began to settle into this new, quiet rhythm, the memories surfaced, unbidden, no longer controlled by the immediate demands of my family. I thought about Edward, not the cruel ex-husband, but the bright, intense young man I married, who used to read poetry to me in the evenings. Where had that tenderness gone? Was the potential for cruelty always there, hidden beneath his ambition? Or did my relentless subservience simply give him permission to discard his gentler self? Is the greatest wound we inflict upon ourselves the decision to prioritize peace over honesty, allowing small acts of cruelty to compound until they become the architecture of our marriage? I missed the idea of Mark and Clara, the warm, easy connection of parent and young child. I yearned for the nostalgic longing for the time when my value was absolute, when my breast and my arms were the entire universe of their safety. Now, their interactions were only transaction. The most difficult confrontation came from Clara. She arrived unannounced, stood on my porch, and began to weep dramatically. Through the glass, I saw her genuine distress, not because of the dress, but because her world had stopped being predictable. I opened the door but did not invite her in. I stood on the threshold, maintaining the physical boundary. "Mom," she wailed, mascara streaking her expensive coat. "I am falling apart. I need you. You always fix everything. Why are you doing this to me?" Her distress was real, but it was centered entirely on her loss of comfort. "Clara," I said, my voice soft, but firm as the granite seawall, "I can no longer be your solution. You are 42 years old. Your happiness is your responsibility. I fixed things for 50 years. Now I am fixing me." She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back slightly, maintaining the necessary emotional distance. She tried to deploy the last weapon of the estranged child: guilt. "If Dad saw you now, so selfish, so cold, he would be so disappointed." The mention of Edward, the casual cruelty of using him as a moral cudgel, hardened my resolve instantly. "Edward was always disappointed, Clara," I stated flatly. "That was his primary mode of interaction. And you know what? I have learned that his disappointment is entirely irrelevant to my life. You need to go home, darling. And you need to learn how to manage your own chaos." I closed the door gently, but firmly. I leaned my back against the wood, trembling slightly, but feeling the fierce, exhilarating pulse of self-preservation. It was an act of cruelty, born of absolute tenderness. Tenderness toward the self I had almost allowed to die. The house began to change. I moved the heavy, dark furniture that Edward had insisted upon, replacing it with lighter, simpler pieces. I hung my first messy watercolor on the kitchen wall, a bold, chaotic streak of blues and greens. It was terrible art, but it was a perfect statement of my new life. I signed up for a beginner's creative writing class at the local community center, an act of pure, unadulterated intellectual indulgence. I learned about narrative structure, character development, and the power of the first-person voice. I realized that for decades, my life had lacked a central narrator. It had only been a series of supporting roles in other people's dramas. Now I was writing my own story. The silence of the house settled from a terrifying void into a productive, nourishing quiet. I was sleeping deeply, waking up not with the burden of immediate duty, but with the curiosity of what the day might bring. The contradiction of my new life was this: I was utterly alone, but I had never felt less lonely. The solitude was a choice, a fierce, protective shell against the exhausting demands of others. I knew the true test was yet to come, the moment when their initial shock wore off and they attempted a more sophisticated form of manipulation. But I had my granite sea wall, and I had learned, finally, that the most important approval I needed was the one I gave myself. My journey had just begun. The old Elena was gone. The new Elena was still learning her name, but she was listening, breathing deeply, and she was entirely, gloriously unscuffed. The family's initial shock quickly evolved into a more dangerous, organized strategy: pity and strategic engagement. They realized that fury and demand were ineffective against the locked door and my quiet resolve. They needed to make me feel needed again, but on their terms. The catalyst for their new assault was the impending holiday season, the time when my domestic services, the complex logistics of hosting, cooking, and emotional management, were most indispensable. Clara sent an email, meticulously crafted, devoid of the previous venom. It was filled with nostalgia and a calculated appeal to my maternal duty. Clara, email subject: thinking of old times. Mom, I was just looking at the photo album from Christmas 2012. Remember the way you always managed to make the house feel so magical? It's hard to imagine the holidays without your touch. Mark and I were talking, and we realize we haven't been supportive of your need for space. We want to make it right. We'd love for you to join us for Christmas dinner, just a quiet, small affair. And maybe you could bring that perfect plum pudding you always make. We miss you, Mom. We miss the real you. The message was a sophisticated snare, wrapping my value entirely in my past performance. They missed the plum pudding. They didn't miss me. They missed the perfection of my service. When a child expresses love only through the lens of their own convenience, does accepting that love diminish the self or simply confirm the transactional nature of the relationship? I felt the familiar, corrosive pang of maternal guilt. The holidays were my domain, my performance. The thought of them struggling, the table imperfectly set, the pudding absent, it brought a quick, sharp stab of anxiety. I walked to the easel and stared at my terrible, magnificent watercolor. I had to choose between the comfortable, familiar role of the martyr and the frightening, uncertain identity of the artist. I composed my reply, concise and absolute. Elena, reply subject, thinking of old times. The real me is currently studying the narrative structure of Chekhov. I will be traveling during the holidays. Please hire a caterer and an event planner. I am unavailable. The refusal was not brutal. It was simply factual. I refuse to be dragged back by the twin chains of nostalgia and convenience. The old Elena would have immediately defaulted to duty. The new Elena prioritized the pursuit of a neglected intellectual desire. The one piece of external validation I allowed myself came from an unexpected source. June. I had met June at the silent retreat, a woman 10 years my junior, a recently retired English professor who had fled her own stifling, expectation-laden marriage. We had not exchanged a single word at the retreat, maintaining the vow of silence, but we had communicated volumes across the shared dining table with only our eyes, a silent, intense recognition of shared emotional exhaustion. After the retreat ended, we exchanged emails, establishing a friendship built on mutual understanding and absolute non-judgment. I told June about the siege, the locks, the plum pudding request, and my overwhelming fear that I had become cold. June's reply was a lifeline of unsentimental wisdom. June, email. Elena, your children are throwing a tantrum because their favorite security blanket has started to bleed. The real you they miss is the compliant, predictable servant. They called you useless because it was easier than recognizing your immense invisible labor. Do not confuse their self-pity with your responsibility. You are not cold. You are simply defining yourself by your own interior temperature, not by the climate control they demand. Her words were a bracing, necessary cold shower. She validated the hidden labor I had provided, acknowledging the immense effort that had been routinely dismissed as nothing. Now, June wrote in a subsequent email, tell me about this creative writing class. What character are you writing that is finally getting to speak? June became my external check, the unflinching mirror that reflected my strength back to me when the familiar pangs of self-doubt crept in. She helped me realize that the self-care they had mocked, the yoga, the painting, was not a frivolous indulgence, but an act of self-preservation. My creative writing class became my anchor. I discovered a fierce, surprising aptitude for narrative structure. My teacher, a young, earnest man who called me Ms. Davies, with genuine professional respect, praised my meticulous plotting and my nuanced depiction of emotional isolation. I started writing a short story, a thinly veiled fictionalization of my own life, narrated by a character named Eleanor, who was forced into silence by her judgmental family. I wrote about the kitchen, the clean baseboards, the sound of the critical sigh. The writing was cathartic, but it was also strategically illuminating. I realized that my children and Edward were not villains. They were simply characters trapped in a narrative I had created for them. I had cast myself as the martyr, and they had simply played their expected roles: the demanding son, the critical daughter, the negligent ex-husband. My silence, my compliance, had been the main source of the drama. During a class critique, the teacher focused on a moment where Eleanor almost speaks her mind, but retreats. This moment, he observed, is where the narrative stalls. We want her to claim her voice. A story only begins when the protagonist decides to act. That night, I went home and rewrote the scene. Eleanor didn't just speak, she acted. She sold the family heirloom furniture and bought a small cabin by the sea. The rewriting felt like a physical realignment of my own spine. I was learning that the greatest power I possessed was the ability to re-narrate my own life. My physical appearance began to change, reflecting the internal shift. I stopped shopping in the dreary, self-effacing sections of department stores. I used some of the money I saved from not catering their events and bought a simple, beautifully tailored wool coat and a pair of elegant leather boots, clothes that were comfortable, functional, and conveyed a sense of self-respect. The new aesthetic was not about being flattering for Clara. It was about being authentic for me. My weekly yoga sessions evolved from agonizing struggles into moments of genuine, quiet strength. I could hold the poses longer. My breathing was deep and even. The physical discipline mirrored my emotional discipline. Every held pose was a silent, defiant refusal to collapse under external pressure. The turbulence of my emotional journey persisted, but the swings were less violent. There were still moments, usually late at night, when the jealousy of their easy, unfettered lives would sting, the envy that they had never had to fight so hard for the simple right to exist without judgment. But the feeling was now a passing cloud, quickly eclipsed by the sharp, invigorating sunlight of my own self-generated purpose. The holiday season arrived. I was not cooking. I was not setting tables. I was sitting on a train, watching the cold, dark landscape rush by, heading toward a coastal town where I was scheduled to attend a week-long Chekhov seminar, accompanied by June. I looked at my phone before turning it off. There was a desperate, final text from Mark. The plumbing is backed up. We don't know who to call. Can you just come back for a day? I smiled, a genuine, unsentimental smile that reached my eyes. I typed the number of a professional plumber I had hired once for my own home and sent the contact information. Then I turned off the phone. The darkness was outside, but inside, I was warm, moving forward, and entirely the protagonist of my own unfolding story. The new Elena was not useless. She was simply unavailable. I will conclude the narrative immediately, focusing on Elena's triumphant, permanent liberation and her transition into a life of purpose and authentic connection. The story will detail her success in the Chekhov seminar, her deepening supportive friendship with June, and the final necessary emotional severing from her entitled family. The prose will maintain the intense, introspective, and detailed style, ensuring the total length significantly exceeds the required symbol count and solidifies the theme of self-worth and ultimate, hard-won happiness. Immersed in the quiet, profound melancholy and precise narrative structure of Russian literature, proved to be the final, necessary catalyst for my transformation. I was not just a student. I was an active, respected participant. My decades of silent observation had furnished me with a library of human behavior that my younger classmates, still entangled in the messy chaos of their own lives, simply lacked. I presented my final piece, the rewritten scene where Eleanor claims her voice and her independence, to a room of attentive peers. The teacher, praising the narrator's unflinching authority, declared it a masterpiece of quiet, late-life liberation. It wasn't just about the writing, it was about the public, intellectual validation that had been starved out of me for years. I was not useless. I was a storyteller, a keen observer, and an articulate mind. June, who sat beside me, simply squeezed my hand, her eyes conveying the profound, shared understanding of two women who had escaped the same velvet cage. Our friendship, forged in silence and sustained by intellectual respect, was the most authentic connection I had built in decades. We traded a houseful of demands for one brilliant sentence, June said later, as we walked along the cold, beautiful shore, the sound of the surf, a steady, rhythmic affirmation. That's the ultimate exchange rate, Elena. I returned home not with a sense of duty, but with a new business plan. I had a clear vision for the final, definitive restructuring of my life. The family, predictably, attempted one final, organized appeal, a joint, tearful visit where they deployed their most potent weapon, Leo, my grandson. I opened the door to find Clara, Mark, and Edward standing there, framing Leo, who held a poorly drawn picture that read, "We love Grandma." Leo, coached and coerced, spoke first, his voice small and confused. "Grandma, why do you have new locks? We miss you." Mommy cries. The sight of Leo, his innocence weaponized, sent a sharp, agonizing stab of maternal guilt through my heart, the last remaining nerve ending of the old Elena. But I held my ground. I knelt down, meeting Leo's eyes, and spoke softly, clearly, ignoring the frantic, manipulative whispers of his mother behind him. "Leo, darling," I said, "I love you absolutely, and I have to teach you the most important lesson I ever learned. Grandma must be a real person first, before she can be a good grandma." I looked up, directly at Clara and Mark, my voice firming with a final, unyielding resolve. "I will not let you use this child's innocence to manipulate my boundaries. The only access you have to me and to this house will be structured, scheduled, and entirely on my terms. You have to learn that my self-respect is not a subject for negotiation." Edward stepped forward, attempting one last arrogant assertion of control. This is absurd, Elena. You're alone. You're isolating yourself. You need us to manage things. I looked at my ex-husband, a man whose judgment I had once feared above all else, and felt only a profound, quiet pity. His entire identity was still predicated on my submission. Edward, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of finality. I am not alone. I have my journal, my easel, my books, and my friends. I have my mind, unscuffed and brilliant. I have learned to manage everything. You, however, appear to be fundamentally incapable of managing your own laundry and your own disappointment. You are now dismissed. I stood up, the movement fluid and strong, a direct result of my daily yoga. I placed a hand gently on Leo's shoulder. I will call you next week, Leo. We will have an outing, just us, to the museum. Then I closed the door. The loud, angry argument that erupted on my porch was their final, pathetic noise. I ignored it. I walked to my kitchen, put on the kettle, and felt the immense, clean silence settle. My new life continued to expand, defined by addition, not subtraction. I formally registered a small business, narrative consulting, where I helped individuals structure their personal histories and financial futures. It was a perfect fusion of my forensic skills and my new passion for story. I dedicated one afternoon a week to Leo, creating a new, healthy relationship built on mutual respect and shared intellectual curiosity. We visited museums, read complex books, and discussed ideas. A pure, unburdened connection, free from the toxic demands of his parents. My house, once a staging ground for domestic labor, was now a beautiful, light-filled space dedicated to creation. My watercolors, though still technically imperfect, were bold and joyful. I felt the profound physical certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. I am Elena, 67, and I am not a martyr. I am a protagonist. I am the architect of my own piece, the narrator of my own story, and the sole sovereign of my own time. The humiliation, the cruelty, the despair, it all became the fuel for this magnificent, self-made life. I had been called useless, but in my quiet disappearance, I had discovered the full, unstoppable power of my own essential worth. The pain of the past was the necessary darkness from which this bright, beautiful future had finally, irrevocably bloomed. My heart, once fractured, was now whole, unscuffed, and eternally happy.